Hello, I'm John Perry, and welcome to Representative Gary Glenn Reports with Representative Gary Glenn.
John, good to be back with you.
Representative, it's good to see you again.
Likewise.
Welcome back. A lot to talk about here today, yourself included. But why don't we start out by chatting about the budget. This week, as we sit here, the House of Representatives approved the state's budget for the 2017 fiscal year that starts in October. There will be a couple of more votes along the way before it goes to the governor. But looking at it all told and looking at it in its components, there's a lot to discuss. We should begin by taking a look at the school aid budget. In the past, you and I have talked about at-risk funding,
right,
especially as it pertains to the schools in Midland. What do you have to report?
Well, Representative Tim Kelly is chairman of the K-12 Subcommittee of Appropriations, and he and I met sometime last year with Jerry Wasserman, who's chairman of the Midland Public School Board, and Mike Sharrow, who's the school superintendent in Midland. So we got something done in this year's House budget that saw its genesis in that meeting in the Midland Public Schools headquarters now over a year ago. The state has a pot of money that's specifically intended to help at-risk children who meet the federal definition of needing assistance with lunch and that kind of thing. And 27% of the students in the Midland Public School District, which is one of the higher income areas in the state of Michigan, but nonetheless, more than one out of four of the kids in the Midland Public Schools meet the definition. But in the past, the money went only to school districts that met a higher percentage threshold of children in that situation. And Jerry Wasserman said, as a matter of principle, and I agreed, the money, if it's intended for at-risk children, ought to follow the children no matter where they live. And we made a little bit of progress last year. The Senate did not concur. But this year's House budget, which I voted for, will include $18 million in money for the first time to go to some of these higher income districts, specifically for whatever percentage of children they have that meet the federal definition of being at risk. If the Senate concurs, that will mean that the Midland Public Schools get some of this at-risk money for the first time ever. So it'll be a pretty big deal.
That's big.
And I credit Jerry Wasserman and Mike Sharrow for pointing me in that direction. If we can get Senate concurrence, then we will have in the second year gotten it done, and that'll be a big deal. If not, we'll keep trying. I've been involved in the process for quite a while, and I'm used to seeing things take multiple attempts, several years sometimes to get done. But we knew that going in. We knew if we wanted to establish that principle, we could plant the flag now and pursue it. But it looks like there's a good possibility we might have actually gotten it done, and that's to the benefit of the Midland Public School District. It is going to be a record high budget, more money spent on K through 12 education than ever in Michigan history, and yet the budget overall increased less than 1% of the overall budget. And if you look at Michigan since 1990, we are second in the country for the smallest state increase in spending over the course of that time. We actually have 25,000 fewer state employees than we had in 1990. And so Michigan has actually set a standard for very conservative budgeting. Now, people have asked, would you apply a standard that said we would never increase our spending by more than inflation perhaps population growth and inflation? And certainly I would be in favor of that kind of standard. I believe that this year's budget actually came in under that standard. But it nonetheless spent more money than we've ever spent on K through 12 education. I wish there was more of a correlation between spending and student performance. But just increasing the amount of money is not enough. The Mackinac Center for Public Policy, which is headquartered in Midland, recently produced the results of a study that showed there was very little correlation between increases in spending on public education and actual test results and student performance. So there are a lot of other things at play, but the money end of it, this is going to be a record high budget. And for Midland Public Schools in particular, if the Senate concurs with the House budget, it'll be the first time ever that Midland has received some of this at-risk money, and it'll be used in the best judgment of the Midland Public School Board to help all the kids in our school system.
And as you pointed out, this is an issue that you put on the radar in the House shortly after you got here in 2015, right, and maybe a reflection of the reality that, it is a process. Sometimes something that starts one year doesn't come to fruition, especially when it comes to budgets, till a year or two, three later.
That's been my experience, so I was not surprised we didn't get it done the first time we tried. but I appreciate Mike Sharrow and Jerry Wasserman pointing me in the right direction. It's another example, and there are multiple such examples. I don't have to be an expert on the issue. My job is to be a representative of the experts on the issue. And in this case, it was Jerry Wasserman and Mike Sharrow with Midland Public Schools. The other districts that I represent, like Meridian and Pinconning and Auburn schools, the Bay City school system, they've been receiving this kind of money before. Midland is one of only 50 districts that had not received it before, but we did get it through the House, and kudos to Representative Tim Kelly. Couldn't have gotten it done without him. Right next door from Saginaw, but he's chairman of the K-12 subcommittee. And as I said, it all started in a meeting with Jerry Wasserman, Mike Sharrow, Representative Kelly, and myself, and John Kennedy of the Midland Daily News well over a year ago. And I'm just hopeful that this year the Senate will concur and we'll be able to say we got it done.
When we talk about government spending, maybe the propensity there is for some people to equate Lansing to Washington, that everybody's spending a whole lot of money, spending is out of control. Really what you're talking about here, at least when it comes to the state of Michigan, is that lawmakers have set, established priorities, and followed through on them.
Well, and several things about the budget. This will be the, sixth year, I think, in a row that it will be done by June 1st.
And that helps schools
whose budgets start July 1st. In the past, under Jennifer Granholm, for example, the state didn't get its budget done until October, months after the schools were trying to balance their budgets. We have now, the Republican-led majority of the House and the Senate, have produced them by June 1st, which means the schools have the opportunity to budget based on what they know they're getting. And in the broader sense, from the K-12 budget, the Meridian Public Schools, Auburn, the schools that I represent in Auburn and Pinconning, are going to get an increase of $120 per pupil. Midland is only getting $60. That's part of the formula. The higher end, the higher spending districts don't get as much. Eventually, we want to work our way toward dollar for dollar uniform budgeting across the board for our schools. But the higher spending districts have gotten less, and that's the case in this budget. But Midland Public Schools will, if the Senate concurs, get this at-risk money for the first time, which the other districts have gotten routinely. But I spoke to the Pinconning Chamber of Commerce Friday morning, for example, and the news that all the students in Pinconning schools were going to get $120 more per pupil were met with appreciation. In fact, Mike Sharrow expressed appreciation for the $60 increase per pupil going to Midland Public Schools, plus hopefully the at-risk money. So it is making an historic investment in K-12 education, and we need to do a whole lot of other things to make sure that, again, knowing that money is not the only answer. For example, I know the Senate and the House have passed different versions of the third grade reading bill. I supported that bill, and Nancy Williams, the director of the Bay City Dyslexia Center, came up with language in an amendment, which I was able to get into the House version of that bill, that would require public schools to help dyslexic children with the same type of proven instructional techniques that in the Dyslexia Center they say has had 100% support. Nancy told me, this is not a small thing but a big thing, that if the public schools will actually implement using these systems, sequential, I don't have to be the expert. She is. But she says it will remove dyslexia as a cause of reading deficiency in the state of Michigan. So that's a big thing. And that's also in the House education budget. And we have, for the first time, educational savings accounts for special ed students. So Representative Kelly's done a great job as a leader in that effort, and I've been happy to support it and be the impetus for the at-risk money for Midland schools, as well as helping the dyslexic kids. But overall, it's a very conservative budget. I would have voted for a budget that spent less. But when you get to this point in the process, it's still nonetheless a very conservative budget by comparison to other states. As I mentioned earlier, since 1990, only one state has had a smaller increase in state spending than Michigan has. So a pretty conservative budget. I know that there are places in any budget where you could find that be removed if that's what you're looking for. But when it gets to this point in the process, you're voting on it as a package. And I thought it was a conservative budget, made a historic investment in K-12 education, and got some things done for our area schools that I think are important.
Representative, on another topic, a topic this spring that has received a lot of attention, revolves around the Michigan Board of Education, State Board of Education, and its proposed guidance for transgender students.
John Austin and the Democrat-controlled State Board of Education issuing these guidelines, which they say are voluntary, but what's a request today but can become an edict tomorrow. And it actually proposes that impressionable young people, K through 12, so first grade through 12th grade, that they be allowed individually to choose which sex they are, or they like to use the word gender. So you could have a young boy who gets to decide that this week I want to be a girl. So I want you to call me by a girl's name. I want you to use the word she. I get to use the girls' bathroom. The student could decide. I get to play on the girls' sports team. So you could have a 6'2", 220-pound guy in high school who says he feels like a girl. He claims to believe he's a girl. He's going to play on the girls' basketball team. I think that's just nonsensical. I think it's bizarre. I think it's radical. And then to clinch it up, they actually propose in the language of the guidelines that none of this will be disclosed to parents. And so all of these bizarre practices would start taking place in our public schools, in any school district that adopted these standards, and school employees would be under instruction under these guidelines not to tell parents about any of this. So intentionally removing any type of parental knowledge or responsibility or involvement in these types of decisions. And you could literally, in an elementary school, see your first grade daughter sharing the girls' restroom with a 6th grade boy who suffers the mental and emotional disorder of believing that he's a girl. Again, I characterize that as bizarre. I think it's overwhelmingly opposed. I think it's opposed by Republicans and Democrats. In fact, this type of thing was proposed as a local city ordinance in Bay County, part of which I represent, which I think on the Bay County Commission is 6-1 Democrat, and it was rejected. It was brought up in the city of Saginaw, which I believe is 9-0 on the city council Democrat, and it was rejected. It was brought up in Sterling Heights, which I believe is overwhelmingly Democrat. It was initially approved, but then the people of Sterling Heights got a citizen petition together, forced it back in front of the city council, at which point they rejected it. So in Michigan in the last 2 or 3 years, even Democrat-controlled local governments have rejected this bizarre type of agenda. And yet John Austin and the left-wing Democrats in control of the State Board of Education are proposing this to be adopted by school districts all across Michigan. I'm personally opposed to it. If necessary, I will support legislation that says, as simply and as a matter of common sense as I think something could be, that in the girls' restroom at your local elementary school, that's going to be for girls. It would seem, I would think, to most parents to be a reasonable solution that if you have a boy, for example, who has this gender dysphoria or mental disorder of believing that he's a girl, that the common sense solution would be to allow him to use a unisex bathroom so that he is not sharing the bathroom or the locker room or the shower with girls who are actually girls. And yet that is not considered a legitimate response or policy decision, because the activists, the political activists who are pushing this change in our social mores and values, they categorize that as a separate but equal policy, comparable to having white high schools and black high schools back in the 60s. And they said separate equal was not acceptable. And they characterized telling a boy who thinks he's a girl that he can use a bathroom that's one stall, that's separate but equal. They insist that a boy who thinks he's a girl really is a girl, and therefore must have the right to use the girls' restroom, play on the girls' sports team, and when the game's over, use the same shower. It's nonsensical, and yet we have statewide elected officials who are seriously proposing this for adoption by public schools in Michigan. I'm not the only one who has a problem with this. I mean, there's been a broad base of statements against this among all members, I think, of the Republican House of Representatives and others. There's some legislation being considered. I'll certainly support legislation if necessary to say that your daughter cannot be forced at any school in the state of Michigan to share a restroom or a shower or locker room with a boy.
Representative, we're going to take a break right now, but we'll be back with Representative Gary Glenn reports right after this. And we're back with Representative Gary Glenn reports. And Representative Glenn, if folks do have any concerns about this whole issue of the Department of Education guidance, contact your office?
They can contact my office, John, but also they can Google the State Board of Education, and up until May 10th, which is the deadline the State Board has established, they can communicate their concerns about this new policy directly to the State Board of Education. And one follow-up thought about that, the way these guidelines read, and we know from proposals in other areas, like for example, California and Massachusetts and Colorado have implemented this, imposed this on every K through 12 public school system. So we know from practice that the kid who gets in trouble would be your teenage daughter who objected to having a boy in the locker room with her, changing. And if she complains, then she's portrayed as some bigoted, somebody who's prejudicial, discriminating, and a bigot. If your 15-year-old daughter says she doesn't want to be in the shower, using the same shower as a 17-year-old boy. As I said, it's bizarre, it's unthinkable, and yet we have supposedly responsible elected officials proposing it as a serious proposal. But even more important, I've made pretty clear where I stand on the issue. So really, unless you want to harangue me about it, beat me up on it, that's fine too. But if you want to have impact on whether or not this public policy is adopted, I would encourage viewers to contact the State Board of Education. I believe the website is everyvoicecountsmi.org. Everyvoicecountsmi.org, Michigan. And you can leave your comments with the State Board of Education right there.
You're the Vice Chair of the House Energy Committee. We had a lot of talk about energy back in 2015. As we move into the spring of 2016, what have you been doing in committee?
Well, I attended the Senate Energy Committee meeting yesterday because the Senate now is going to attempt to move a bill, which unfortunately and disappointingly is no better than, and in fact, from my perspective, worse than the House energy proposal. Our two incumbent monopoly utilities don't like competition, is the bottom line. I favor competition, consumer choice. I believe Bay City schools should continue to be able to choose if they want to buy electricity from somebody other than Consumers Energy, and because it costs them $200,000 a year less. I'd like to see the law change so that Midland and Meridian and Penn County schools could make the same choice, but by law, they can't. It just doesn't make sense to people. Saginaw Valley State saves $200,000 a year just on their electricity bill. Northwood and Delta College prohibited by law from doing so. But the Senate side is going to try to move something now. I'm hopeful we can stop that as we did, or at least have to date, in the House. But this past week was significant because a representative of MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which is, and I'm told it's kind of like a Star Trek bridge setup in Indiana, where they control energy flow among multiple states, all the way from Louisiana to Michigan. So if Louisiana's a little short on energy being produced at their power plants, they can bring some in from Missouri and keep it all balanced. And if Michigan's a little short, well, we take it in from Indiana, vice versa. And they balance the energy resources of the entire middle of the continent to make sure everybody always has what they're required to have by the federal government. This person came in and testified before the Senate Energy Committee and also the House Energy Committee. We're going to show a clip here in a minute of my questioning of the lady, Melissa, representing MISO. I think what we succeeded in doing, John, was eviscerating the narrative that we are somehow facing some type of crisis. It's been some 15 months now since I took office back in January of 2015. The people in this area, as well as statewide, saw those $2 million worth of TV ads that were put on by the front group, paid for by Consumers Energy and Detroit Edison, that said you're going to have 9 coal-fired plants shutting down, and we're going to suffer a shortfall, which to the average citizen sounds like a shortage. Shortfall doesn't mean that at all. It simply means a reduction in the margin of extra on top of all the energy that we need. On the hottest day in August when everybody's air conditioners are running, you have to have 100% plus a 15% margin. And the MISO representative showed us a a graph that said that the margin that we have now would shrink over the next several years, but we're going to see in the clip, what does that really mean? Is it really a crisis? And straight from the mouth of the expert witness came the testimony that made it clear, I believe, there is no crisis. There is no justification for giving our incumbent utilities, DTE and consumers, total monopoly control of the energy market, electricity market in Michigan, and stripping away from Bay City schools and other school districts across the state. In fact, it's about 40% of all the public school districts in Michigan buy their electricity from somebody other than the two big utilities. And if you took that away, it would take away some $25 to $30 million in annual savings. The business agent for the Clarkston schools testified in front of the House Energy Committee way back a year ago that they saved $350,000 a year, and if we took away electricity choice, they'd have to lay off 5 teachers. And that really put it in perspective for people who are wondering what's the practical effect. So I'm going to continue to be an advocate for expanded choice. I want all school districts. Frankly, I'd like to see all electricity users be free to choose. We ought to start with the government entities like schools and city and county buildings so that at least when they're saving money on the light bill, they're saving the taxpayers' money. But let's go to this clip so that people can watch for about 5 minutes and hear the single most knowledgeable expert on likely energy capacity in the Midwest and in Michigan, I believe make clear there's really not this crisis narrative that the utilities spent $2 million in TV ads to try and tell us last year. Thing that I recall, and again, this is something we haven't really talked about this substantively for 5 or 6 months, but if I recall the legislation that passed this committee, there's a requirement that alternative energy suppliers have to contract in advance for 3 years' worth of capacity. But in a crisis situation, if I remember correctly, and a trigger point of that being if you saw a price increase of 1,000% or higher, it'd go from 3 years to 5-year pre-contract requirement, I believe is the trigger. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman? Is that your recollection? Can you repeat that again? Yeah, the trigger of going from 3-year capacity to 5-year was a 1,000% increase in price? Okay. I recall that the governor's representative testified before us in November that that would be an extremely rare instance to ever have a price increase of 1,000. What was the percentage increase of the price increase you just saw in April? 2,000%? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we would be in a crisis situation under the bill that passed the House committee back in November, which means AESs would be required to buy 5 years in advance under the situation we're under right now, which we were told by the governor's office would be rare and unlikely. And I want to make sure I understand your page 6 graph, because for somebody fairly new to the issue, and I know to the general public, if you don't know the difference between the word shortfall and shortage and crisis, we had $2 million worth of TV ads telling us there was this impending crisis. So I note that system-wide, and I assume you took into account the closure of all the plants in Michigan and all the closure of plants in any other state in MISO, and yet next year you're projecting an increase in capacity, taking into account all those closures. Then you get down to a 15.2% margin in 2019, which if I understand you say is consistent with the industry standard. 1 day in 10 you might have a blackout. That's right. You got to go all the way out to 2023 to get to 13%, 2025 to get to 11%. And if I understood your response to the chairman's question, what would a 10% reserve margin mean? Did you say that might mean 2 days?
Right. I don't have the chart in front of me, but it could be 2 days in 10.
Obviously, 0 days in 10 years would be the ideal, but that would be cost prohibitive to achieve. My point simply being that nowhere here do I see crisis or impending crisis that would justify returning monopoly control to a couple of utilities. Now, you also said that there were 3 ways that anybody who's going to provide electricity in Michigan could get the capacity, either own it, contract for it, or buy it. I'm going to ask you, for example, in terms of transparency, from the interest of ratepayers, of those 3 options, which ones are more transparent than the others? Which ones are private, the public's not going to know what's going on? as opposed to which ones are transparent. It'll be a matter of public record. So which of those three are most transparent in terms of policymakers, the media, ratepayers' ability to know the price signal being set?
Yeah, so the planning resource auction is going to give you the most transparency about the price.
And right now you do a one-year auction,
right.
But you're about to propose a 3-year auction.
For competitive retail choice areas of our footprint. So not across our footprint, but for
Like
areas
for us.
with competitive retail choice.
And I assume you would not propose that unless you had a pretty high degree of confidence that it would meet the requirement that you require, you yourself require.
So it's pretty consistent with what we've seen other RTOs put in place, and it is what we believe will send, and since we can't, it's what we think will incent generation to get existing generation to stay online and incent new generation to get built.
Melissa, you know far more about this issue than I do. But this 3-year auction you're proposing, you said you're confident that it will send the correct price signal to incentivize construction of new capacity, and it's more transparent than the other options. Those sound like two pretty good things to me. Transparency, why is that important? I mean, what's the difference between a private, the legislation that passed this committee would require an AES, for example, to enter into a 3-year contract, or in this current crisis situation just triggered by your last auction, a 5-year private contract. Nobody know what the price was, right? So no transparency. Your 3-year auction would be open to the public. It would all be a matter of public record, and you have a high degree of confidence in it, or you wouldn't propose it.
Right. I mean, I think one of the differences that I do want to point out, however, is if you're talking about more bilateral contracts, if you're contracting, I mean, and this is just something to be aware of, our auction is going to be 3 years for 1 year, right? So you're going to get a 1-year capacity price. Usually bilaterals, you're right, are not transparent, but our footprint, almost 90% of our footprint uses bilateral contracts or own generation to meet the requirements. And the thing is, the longer the contract, normally the more price favorable they are, because they, if as we've seen, they're just, longer term just makes a big difference. But we do not have price transparency around the bilaterals. You are correct.
And you said that the legislation that has passed this committee would be one way we could meet your requirements.
That's correct.
But another way that's more transparent would be to rely on your proposal for a 3-year auction. And it would not only be more transparent, it would also be market-driven, correct?
It's market-based.
It wouldn't be arbitrary. 3 years triggered by a 2,000% price increase, go to 5 years, which, by the way, the AES has testified to us would put them out of business. So 40% of public schools would no longer have the access to choice, according to them. But the auction would be transparent, market-driven, scientific, as opposed to some arbitrary standard that we in our expertise as policymakers have thought would be appropriate. But either one, you believe, would meet the standards that MISO requires.
Yeah, I believe if the state puts in something that would meet the standard, and then that's correct.
And we're back with Representative Gary Glenn Reports. Representative, before we finish up, we should probably chat a little bit about a multi-bill package. You had a bill in that deals with the definition of veteran. It sounds as though there were actually multiple definitions of veteran in state law. That created a problem that is being solved.
I'm on the Military and Veterans Affairs Committee, and each one of us took one of these bills in the package. There are really about 20, so we spread them around. But in my case, it changed the definition of veteran in the Korean War pay bill for veterans who live here in Michigan. The problem was there were differing definitions of veteran in different parts of state law. Some of them were in conflict with the federal definition of veteran. And so you'd have veterans trying to apply for benefits they had earned, rightly earned in service to our country, and found it frustrating to find the law said one thing here and something else over here. So throughout state law, we now have a uniform, or assuming the Senate passes the bills and the governor signs them, we're going to have a uniform definition of veteran throughout state law, the purpose being to make it easier for veterans to get the benefits that they've earned. And I've had 3 bills come up for a vote in the House of Representatives. The other 2 got 104 votes, and this one got 108 votes. It was unanimous, 108-0, Republican and Democrat. And hopefully I'll come up with some other bills that may not be unanimous, but would have, positive benefit for my district. But so far, 3 bills that I've had come up for a vote on the floor, and none of them have got less than 104 votes. Obviously, bipartisan support for those who thought I wasn't capable of working with Democrats. And I think we've proven that wrong, because I'm co-sponsoring bills with Democrats, like a FOIA bill to apply to the legislature and to the governor, along with Representative Jerry Moss.
Jeremy Moss.
Let's do that over. For example, co-sponsoring with Representative Jeremy Moss from Southfield, a Democrat, a bill that would say that the governor and the legislature have to abide by FOIA-type standards. But nonetheless, I'm pleased to have gotten bipartisan support for that veterans bill as well.
Finally, Representative, you have been in the thoughts and prayers of a lot of people as you've battled cancer over the last few months. Where do things stand right now?
Well, and John, let me say that your wife, Carrie, I know, is in the same situation, so she's in our thoughts and prayers as well as you are. And I do appreciate all the prayers, not just for me, but for my children, my wife, Annette, who's become my driver on those days when it's a little tiring. But the cancer experts at the University of Michigan tell me the cancer's in remission. It's gone. It's a prostate cancer, and went from a PSA test where if you have 4 or higher, that means cancer's there, and mine started out at 348 on January 15th. The last time we were at University of Michigan, it was 0.2. One medical professional finally used the word miracle to go from 348 to 0.2, so that was good. But as an insurance policy, they want me to take chemotherapy anyway. So I'm in the process of that, would appreciate the continued prayers. But the one thing that's important from a public policy standpoint, John, is that throughout all of those treatments, I have not missed a single committee meeting. I have not missed a single vote. And as long as I'm breathing and physically able, I intend for that to continue to be the case. The response to the treatments after the first week is pretty rough, but nonetheless have been able to maintain the energy level sufficient to do the job that the people of Midland and Bay counties elected me to do. Intend to continue to do that, but will also continue to be strengthened in that resolve by the prayers of people, if they would, for my wife and my children and my family and me.
Representative Gary Glenn, thank you very much.
Good to see you again, John.
And thank you for joining us on Representative Gary Glenn Reports.